Some doors in a palace are never meant to be opened, not because of what waits behind them, but because of who might walk out changed. On the morning this story begins, a princess opened one of those doors, and by the time she closed it again, the oldest promise in the kingdom of Ashenreach was hanging by a thread. She was not a queen. She was not the heir. She held no army and signed no laws. But she was about to stand in a room full of the most powerful men in the realm and tell them, to their faces, that they were making a terrible mistake. And the strangest part of it all, the man she was about to challenge was her own brother, the king. The kingdom of Ashenreach sat between two gray rivers, an old land of stone bridges and slow bells. Its palace, called Hymero, had stood for 400 years, and in all that time it had kept one rule above every other. Every choice that touched the crown, every law, every treaty, every secret that could change who held power had to be spoken out loud. Not written quietly, not decided behind a shut door. Spoken in front of the full Privy Council, where every lord could hear it and every clerk could write it down. The people of Ashenreach did not know much about their government, but they knew this one thing and they were proud of it. In their kingdom, power had to speak in daylight. Princess Rowena had believed in that rule her whole life. She was the king's younger sister, 51 years old, with gray coming into her dark hair and a back that never seemed to bend. The court called her many things. Some called her cold, some called her stubborn. The servants, who saw her more honestly than the lords did, simply called her fair. She was the royal who arrived first and left last. She opened hospitals nobody else wanted to visit. She stood in the rain at soldiers' funerals when the weather kept softer royals indoors. She had no crown of her own and had never wanted one. What she wanted was for the kingdom to keep its word, and to keep working, long after everyone in this room was gone. That was why, on this cold morning, she noticed something the others missed. The Privy Council met in the long chamber, a room shaped like the inside of a ship turned upside down. 30 lords sat along a dark oak table. At the head sat King Aldous, Rowena's brother, 63 years old and tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He had been a strong king once, but the last 2 winters had taken something out of him. He coughed more than he spoke now, and he leaned on the men around him more than a king should. Rowena saw it every day and said nothing, because saying it would have hurt him, and she loved him too much for that. Beside the king stood the man who had become his shadow, Lord Chancellor Merrick Vane. Vane was younger than most of the council, only 44, and he wore that youth like an advantage. He was clever, smooth, and endlessly patient. He never raised his voice. He never lost his temper. He had a way of making the hardest idea sound like simple common sense, so that by the time you understood what he was really asking for, you had already agreed to it. Over the past year, he had made himself useful to the king in 100 small ways. He remembered names. He handled the boring work. He was always there, at the king's elbow, with the right paper at the right moment. And slowly, so slowly that almost nobody noticed, King Aldous had stopped deciding things and started signing what Vane put in front of him. Almost nobody noticed. Rowena noticed. On this morning, Vane rose to his feet with a thin roll of parchment in his hand and a gentle smile on his face. "My lords," he began, "we all love the old ways. I love them as much as any man here, but love should not make us blind. Ashenreach is not the small kingdom it was 400 years ago. The world moves faster now. Our enemies decide in hours what takes us weeks, and every week that we spend talking in this chamber is a week our rivals spend acting." A few of the older lords shifted in their seats. Rowena watched their faces. She had learned long ago that in a room like this, the words mattered less than the eyes. "So I bring the king a small proposal," Vane went on, lifting the parchment. "A modest change, nothing that touches the heart of our traditions, only a matter of speed." He let the word hang there, speed, such a harmless word. "Under the old rule," he continued, "every matter of the crown must be spoken before this full council. 30 lords, every clerk, every time, and that is beautiful, my lords, truly. But it is also slow. So I propose we keep the full council for the great questions, the wars, the treaties, the laws. And for the smaller, faster matters we create a new body, a small circle. Say the king and 3 trusted advisors, meeting quickly and quietly, deciding at once, so that Ashenreach need never again be caught sleeping while the world moves on. He rolled the parchment shut. A committee for efficiency, nothing more. There was a soft murmur of approval around the table. It sounded so reasonable. It sounded so kind. Who could argue against being faster? Who wanted the kingdom caught asleep? King Aldous nodded slowly, and even that small movement seemed to cost him. "It seems sensible, Merrick," he said, his voice rough. "We are not children. We can be trusted to know a small matter from a great one." And that was the moment. That was the exact moment when Rowena felt the cold thing move in her chest. Because she had heard the words, but she had also heard what lived underneath them. A small circle. The king and 3 trusted advisors, meeting quietly, deciding at once. No full council to hear it. No 30 lords to argue. No clerk to write it down where the people could one day read it. And who would choose which matters were small? Who would decide what belonged to the quiet room and what belonged to the daylight? Not the king. The king was too tired to fight over such things anymore. It would be the man standing at his elbow with the right paper at the right moment. It would be Merrick Vane. She saw it then, whole and clear, the way you sometimes see the shape of a thing in a single flash of lightning. This was not about speed. This was about a door. A door that, once built, could be shut. And behind a shut door, a clever man could do almost anything and call it small, and no one would ever hear him do it. Rowena's hands were very still on the table. Around her, heads were nodding. The thing was nearly done. In another minute the king would say yes, and the council would agree, and the oldest rule in Ashenreach, power must speak in daylight, would have a hole cut into it that could never be sewn shut again. She could stay silent. That was allowed. She had no vote here, only a seat, a courtesy given to the king's sister. Nobody expected her to speak. Nobody wanted her to. It would be so easy to let it pass, to tell herself she had misread it, to keep the peace with her brother and go home to her quiet rooms. Instead, she stood up. The scrape of her chair on the stone floor was the only sound in the chamber. 30 faces turned toward her. King Aldous blinked, surprised. And Merrick Vane's gentle smile did not move at all, but something behind his eyes went very cold, very fast, and then hid itself again. "Forgive me," Rowena said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried, it always did. "I have a question, only one." "Of course, sister," the king said, though a flicker of unease crossed his tired face. He knew her. He knew that when Rowena said only one, it was never only one. She looked at Vane, not at her brother. "This new circle you describe, the king and 3 advisors deciding quietly, I understand the speed of it. What I do not understand is the choosing. Who decides which matters go to the small room and which come here to the full council in the light?" For a heartbeat, Vane said nothing. It was the smallest of pauses. Most people would not have caught it. Rowena caught it. "The king, naturally," Vane said smoothly. "His Majesty would decide." "His Majesty is tired," Rowena said. The words were gentle, but they landed like a stone in still water. Around the table, lords went stiff. Nobody spoke of the king's weakness. Nobody. It was the one truth that everyone knew and no one would say. And she had just said it plainly in the open chamber in daylight, because daylight was the very thing she was fighting for. King Aldous' face tightened. "Rowena, I say it because I love you, brother, and because it is true, and because in this room truth is supposed to be spoken." She turned back to Vane. "The king will not read every paper and weigh every matter and decide, alone, what is small and what is great. He will trust someone to bring the papers to him already sorted, already decided. He will trust the man at his elbow. So I will ask my question again. And this time I will ask it plainly, because plain is the only way I know how to speak. Who, in truth, decides what stays hidden?" The silence in the long chamber was total. Vane's smile held, but it had become a mask now, and everyone could feel it. "The princess sees shadows where there are none," he said softly. "I serve the king. I have only ever served the king." "I am sure you have," Rowena said, and she did not sit down. That was the thing that unsettled the room more than her words. She did not sit down. She stood there, straight-backed, gray coming into her dark hair, an old woman with no crown and no vote, and she simply refused to sit until she had an answer that was true. King Aldous looked from his sister to his chancellor and back again, and for one moment the tired old king from before was gone, and the sharp young man he had once been looked out through his eyes. He had seen something. Rowena watched him see it. But then the moment passed, and the tiredness came back down over his face like a curtain, and he lifted a weary hand. "Enough," he said. "This is a small matter, Rowena. You are making a mountain of a stone. We will discuss the details another day. Sit, please. You are tiring yourself." It was meant kindly. It was even meant lovingly. But Rowena understood exactly what it was. It was the door beginning to close, not slammed. Just eased shut gently, the way Merrick Vane did everything, so gently that by the time you noticed, it was already too late to stop it. She sat down. But as she lowered herself into her chair, she did not lower her eyes. She held Vane's gaze across the long oak table, and in that look she made him a promise without saying a single word. "This is not finished." And Vane, who was cleverer than anyone in the room, understood the promise perfectly. He gave her the smallest nod, courteous, almost respectful, the nod of one careful enemy to another at the start of a long game. The council moved on to other business. Grain stores, a bridge in the north, a marriage in a lesser house, ordinary things. And all through it, Rowena sat very still and thought and did not hear a word of it. Because she knew now what she was up against, and she knew she was almost entirely alone. The king would not help her. He was too tired and too fond of the man who made his days easier. The lords would not help her. They had nodded along, half of them relieved to have less work, the other half simply afraid to be the one who spoke against the tide. She had no proof of anything. She had only a feeling, a cold, certain, bone-deep feeling, that a good man was being slowly walked toward a cliff, and that the smiling man beside him was the one holding the map. Feelings were not enough. She knew that. In a room like the long chamber, a feeling was worth nothing. She would need proof. She would need to understand exactly what Merrick Vane truly wanted and why, and what he intended to push through that quiet little door once it was built. And she would need to do all of it quietly herself, without her brother learning she was working against his favorite, because the moment Aldous believed his sister was fighting his chancellor, he would choose the chancellor, and she would lose him, not just the argument, but him, her brother, the last of her family. That was the price on the table. She saw it clearly. To protect the kingdom's oldest promise, she might have to break the king's trust in her. To save the daylight, she might have to work in the dark. There was a bitter kind of joke in that, and Rowena, who had a dry sense of humor that few people ever got to see, almost smiled at it. When the council finally ended, the lords rose and filed out in their pairs, talking low. Merrick Vane gathered his papers without hurry. As he passed Rowena's chair, he paused and bowed to her with perfect grace. "Your Highness fights for the old ways," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "It is admirable. I truly mean that. But the old ways are a house that is falling down, and I am only trying to build something that will stand. You will see in time that we want the same thing. We simply disagree about the walls." "No, Lord Chancellor," Rowena said just as quietly. "We do not want the same thing. You want a room where no one can hear you. I want a kingdom where everyone can. Those are not walls we disagree about. That is the whole house." For one long second the mask slipped, and she saw the real Merrick Vane looking out at her, not gentle at all, but hard and bright and utterly certain of himself. A man who had decided long ago that the world belonged to whoever was clever enough to take it quietly. Then the mask returned, the gentle smile, the patient eyes. "We shall see," he said, and bowed again and walked away. Rowena sat alone in the emptying chamber for a long while after he had gone. The great room grew cold as the fires died down. A single clerk lingered at the far end, gathering the day's papers into a leather case, and the soft sound of shuffling parchment was the only noise left in 400 years of stone. She looked at the head of the table at the empty chair where her brother had sat. She thought about the boy he had been long ago before the crown, when they were children running through these same halls and Hymero had felt like the safest place in all the world. He had protected her then. Once, when she was 7 and had broken a treasured vase, he had taken the blame himself and been beaten for it, and had never once told her, though she found out years later from an old servant. That was who Aldous truly was, underneath the tiredness. A man who took the blows so others would not have to. Now it was her turn. He would not know it and she could not tell him, and one day, if she failed, he might even hate her for it. But she was going to stand between her brother and the cliff, whether he thanked her for it or not. That was what it meant to love someone, not to make them comfortable, to keep them safe. Rowena rose from her chair. Her knees ached, they always did now in the cold, but her back stayed straight. She walked the length of the long chamber, her footsteps echoing, and as she reached the great doors, she stopped beside the young clerk who was still packing away the records. "You wrote down everything today?" she asked him. "Every word that was spoken?" The young man looked up, startled to be addressed by a princess. He was perhaps 19, with ink on his fingers and a nervous, honest face. "Yes, Your Highness, every word. That is the rule." "That is the rule," Rowena agreed softly. "For now." She studied him for a moment. "What is your name?" "Tobin, Your Highness." "Tobin?" She nodded slowly, as if filing the name away somewhere important. "Keep writing everything down, Tobin. No matter what anyone tells you. No matter who tells you to stop. Do you understand me? Everything in daylight where it can be read. That is the most important work in this palace, and one day you may be the only one still doing it." The young clerk did not understand what she meant. How could he? But he heard the weight in her voice, and something in it made him stand a little straighter. "I will, Your Highness," he said. "I promise." Rowena almost smiled again. A princess with no army and a clerk with an inkpot. It was not much of a beginning. But every war began somewhere, and hers had just begun with a promise from a 19-year-old boy in an empty room. She stepped out through the great doors into the cold corridor, where the torches burned low and her breath showed white in the air. Somewhere in the palace above her, Merrick Vane was already at work, already turning today's small victory into tomorrow's larger one, already sorting the papers that would decide which truths lived in the light and which would vanish into the quiet room he was building. He was faster than her. He was cleverer than most. He had the king's ear and the council's tired agreement and a year's head start. But he had made one mistake, and he did not even know it yet. He had let Princess Rowena stand up. And Princess Rowena, once she was standing, did not know how to sit back down. There are two kinds of quiet in a palace. There is the quiet of peace, and there is the quiet of a thing being hidden. In the weeks that followed the council meeting, Princess Rowena learned to tell them apart. And what she found, in room after room and record after record, was that Hymero had become full of the second kind of quiet, the kind that meant something was being kept from the light. She had thought she was fighting one small proposal. She was wrong. The proposal was only the door. What waited on the other side of it was far worse than she had imagined, and by the time she understood it, she had already made an enemy of the one person in the world she could not afford to lose. She began where any careful person begins, with paper. The records of the Privy Council were kept in the vault room, 3 floors beneath the palace, in a cold stone chamber that smelled of dust and old ink. Every word ever spoken in the long chamber was written there, bound in leather volumes going back 400 years. It was the memory of the kingdom, and by law, any member of the council could read it. Rowena had never once had reason to. Now she went there almost every morning, before the court woke, wrapped in a plain gray cloak so the servants would not gossip. Tobin, the young clerk, met her there. He had kept his promise, and more than that, he had understood slowly, over those first few days, that the princess was not simply curious. He was frightened. She could see it in the way his hands shook when he pulled the volumes from the shelves. But he was also, underneath the fear, a deeply honest young man who had spent 2 years quietly troubled by things he had seen and could not explain. Rowena had given those troubles a shape. And a frightened man with a shape for his fear becomes, sometimes, a very brave one. "I marked the pages your highness asked about," Tobin whispered, though there was no one to hear them. He laid 3 heavy volumes open on the reading table. "The land grants in the eastern valleys, the harbor tariffs, and the mine leases in the Greywolds, all from the last year. All decided very fast. All decided when the chamber was thin." "Thin," Rowena repeated. "Explain." "On days when many lords were away, your highness, hunting, or ill, or called home for one reason or another." Tobin's honest face was pale in the candlelight. "I noticed it because I write the attendance. There is a pattern to who is missing on the days the important votes happen. The lords who might argue are always the ones who are gone, and the ones who stay are always the ones who agree." Rowena went very still. This was the first hard thing, not a feeling, a fact written in a boy's careful hand. Someone was arranging the room before the votes. Someone was making sure that on the days that mattered only the friendly voices were present, and she did not have to wonder who. There was only one man in the palace who handled the council's schedule, who sent the summonses and arranged the king's calendar and knew, weeks in advance, which lord would be where. Merrick Vane had not needed his quiet committee at all. He had already been doing quietly for a year exactly what the committee would let him do openly. The proposal was not the beginning of the theft. It was the point where he had grown confident enough to make the theft legal. "Who benefits?" she asked softly. "The land, the tariffs, the mines follow the paper. Who ends up richer?" Tobin swallowed. "That is the part I could not follow alone, your highness. The grants go to trading houses. Houses I had never heard of, new names, but—" he hesitated. But I looked into who owns them. It took me a long time, and they are not truly new houses at all. They are old money wearing new names. And every one of them, when you dig far enough down, leads back to the same place." He looked up at her, and his young voice dropped to almost nothing. "The House of Vane, your highness, his family, his cousins, himself." There it was, whole and clear, written in ledgers instead of lightning this time, but just as bright. Merrick Vane was not merely hungry for power. He was using the king's tired signature to pour the wealth of the kingdom, its valleys, its harbors, its mines, quietly into his own family's hands, one thin-chambered vote at a time. And once his committee existed, once the door was built, he would no longer even need thin days. He could simply decide in the quiet room, with the king and 2 chosen friends, and no clerk like Tobin would ever write it down at all. Rowena closed the heavy volume slowly. Her hands, she noticed, were perfectly steady. That was the strange thing about real fear, the deep kind. It did not make her shake. It made her calm. "You have done a dangerous thing, Tobin," she said quietly. "You know that." "Yes, your highness." "If Vane learns what you have shown me, you will not simply lose your post. You understand that too." The young clerk was quiet for a moment. Then he lifted his chin. "My father was a clerk before me, your highness, and his father before him. 3 generations we have written down the truth of this kingdom in daylight where it could be read. That is the whole reason our family exists. If I let a man cut a hole in that and stayed silent to keep my post, then I would not be a clerk. I would just be furniture that holds a pen." He almost smiled, that same dry, tired smile she sometimes wore herself. "I would rather be a clerk, your highness, even a frightened one." Rowena looked at this 19-year-old boy with ink on his fingers and felt something she had not felt in a long time. Hope. Small and stubborn, like a weed pushing up through stone. She was not entirely alone after all. There were still people in Hymero who believed that the truth was worth the danger of telling it. She only had to find them and gather them and give them a reason to stand. But hope, she reminded herself, was not proof a king would accept. And a king was exactly what she had to convince. She thought about it for 3 cold nights. The problem was cruel in its simplicity. She could not go to Aldous with ledgers and attendance records and say your chancellor is robbing you, because the moment she did, one of 2 things would happen. Either the king, tired and fond of the man who eased his days, would refuse to believe her and grow angry, or he would believe her, and the shock and the shame of it, the betrayal by a man he had trusted like a son, might break what little strength he had left. She had watched her brother fade for 2 winters. She was genuinely afraid that this truth might be the thing that finished him. So she chose a different path, a gentler one. She would not accuse. She would simply make her brother see with his own eyes in his own time, so that the truth came from inside him rather than from her mouth. She would ask the king for a private supper, just the 2 of them, the way they used to when they were young, and she would talk to him not as a council member but as his sister, and she would set the small stones down one by one and let him build the shape himself. It was a good plan. It was a loving plan, and Merrick Vane destroyed it before it ever began, because Merrick Vane, unlike Rowena, did not wait to be sure. He acted on suspicion, and he had been suspicious of the princess since the moment she refused to sit down. She did not know it, but her morning visits to the vault room had been noticed. A servant had mentioned the gray cloak. A guard had mentioned the early hours. It was nothing, a handful of small, quiet noises, but Vane's entire genius was for hearing the quiet kind. He put the pieces together the way he put everything together, patiently, completely, and then he did what he always did. He got there first. Rowena requested her private supper with the king. Word came back that His Majesty would be delighted, and a date was set for 3 days on. She spent those 3 days preparing what she would say, choosing her stones with care. And on the very morning of the supper, before she could speak a single word to her brother, she was summoned, not invited, summoned to the king's study. She knew, walking those corridors, that something had gone wrong. The summons was too sharp. The guard who brought it would not meet her eyes. When she entered the study, the king was not alone. Merrick Vane stood beside him, by the tall window, a sheaf of papers in his hands and an expression of deep, sorrowful concern on his face. And King Aldous, her brother, who had once taken a beating so she would not have to, looked at her across the room with something she had never seen him turn on her before in all her 51 years. Cold anger. "Sister," the king said, and his voice was rough, not with tiredness now but with a hurt that had turned hard. "Merrick has brought me a troubling report. He tells me you have been in the vault room, every morning, in secret, digging through the private records of my council, setting a young clerk to spy on the attendance of my lords." He set down the cup he had been holding, and his hand was not quite steady. "Tell me it is not true. Tell me my own sister has not been building a case against me in the dark, in a palace whose whole pride is that we do nothing in the dark." And there it was. The cleverness of it took her breath away, even as it landed like a blow. Vane had not hidden the theft. He had done something far smarter. He had taken her investigation of him and turned it inside out, so that the very act of searching for the truth in daylight became, in the telling, a betrayal done in shadow. She had gone to the vault room precisely because it was the lawful, open place to read the records, and Vane had made those same visits sound like the crawling of a spy. She understood in that terrible moment exactly how good her enemy was. He did not need to be innocent. He only needed to make her look guilty first. "Brother," she began, keeping her voice level, "I was reading the council records, which any member of the council may lawfully do. There is no secret in it. I read them in the morning only because that is when the room is quiet and I could think." "In a gray cloak," Vane said gently, not unkindly, as though he genuinely regretted having to mention it. "So the servants would not know it was Her Highness. I do not doubt the princess's intentions for a moment, Majesty. I am certain she believes she is protecting you, but you must see how it looks. The king's own sister, disguised, meeting a junior clerk before dawn, combing the private votes of your council for what? What is it you are looking for, your highness? Say it plainly. You are famous for speaking plainly. Say it now in front of your brother. And that was the trap inside the trap. Because now, if she said it, if she stood in this room and accused Merrick Vane of robbing the crown, she would be doing the exact thing she had sworn not to do. She would be dropping the whole terrible weight of it onto her brother, without the gentle path she had planned, without the time and the supper and the stones laid down one by one. She would be forcing tired, hurting Aldous to choose, right now on the spot, between his sister and the man who had made himself indispensable, and she was no longer sure her brother would choose her. But if she stayed silent, she confirmed the very picture Vane had painted, a schemer caught with nothing honest to say. She looked at her brother's face, at the hurt and the anger, and underneath it the fear, because Aldous was afraid too. She saw that now, afraid of being made a fool, afraid of learning that his own judgment had failed him. He did not want the truth she carried. He wanted, desperately, for her to make the hurt go away and tell him everything was fine. And Rowena, who loved him, could not lie to him, but she also could not yet tell him the whole truth without breaking him, so she did the only thing she could. She told him a smaller truth and asked for time. I am looking, she said slowly, for whether the votes of your council are being decided honestly. That is all. I have found things that trouble me. I do not yet fully understand them, and I will not throw a heavy accusation at you before I am certain, because you deserve certainty, not fear. Give me a little time, brother. Let me be sure. And then I will come to you in daylight in the open and lay it all before you plainly, and you may judge for yourself. I ask only that you wait before you believe I have wronged you. For a moment, just a moment, she thought it had worked. She saw the old sharpness flicker back into her brother's eyes, that glimpse of the young king who had once been able to smell a lie across a crowded hall. He looked at Vane. He looked at her. He was weighing it. And then Merrick Vane, who missed nothing, played his last stone. Of course her highness has found things that trouble her, he said softly, sorrowfully. I would expect nothing less of so careful a mind, but Majesty, think on when this began. Her highness's troubles began the very day I brought you a proposal to make your council faster and lighten your burden, a proposal to serve you. She has opposed it from the first breath, and now she searches your records for a crime to hang upon it. He spread his hands, the picture of a wounded, patient man. I do not say the princess is dishonest. I say only this. Sometimes those who love us most cannot bear to see us grow old and lean on other men. Sometimes they would rather believe the kingdom is full of thieves than admit that their brother simply needs a little help. I think her highness loves you so much that she cannot stand to share you. He bowed his head. It is the kindest explanation I can offer, and I fear it is the true one. It was perfect. It was monstrous, and it was perfect. He had taken her love, the truest thing about her, the reason she was standing here at all, and turned it into the very proof of her supposed madness. He had made her devotion into a sickness. And the terrible thing, the thing that made it so hard to fight, was that a piece of it sounded true. She did hate watching her brother lean on other men. She did wish it were still only the two of them. Vane had found the one honest thread in her heart, and woven it into a lie so tightly that she could not pull them apart. She saw her brother's face change, saw the sharpness fade and the tiredness come back, and behind the tiredness a soft, sad, pitying look settle over his features, a look that was somehow worse than the anger had been, because the anger had at least treated her as an equal, as a threat, as a person to be reckoned with. This new look treated her as something to be managed, a grieving, overprotective sister who could not let go. Rowena, Aldous said, and his voice was gentle now, and that gentleness was the sound of a door easing shut. I know you love me. I have never once doubted it, but you must stop this. There is no thief. There is only an old king and a good man trying to help him carry the weight. Let it go, sister, for your own sake, please. Brother, that is the end of it. He lifted his hand, the same weary gesture he had used in the long chamber, the gesture that meant no more. You will not return to the vault room. You will leave the clerk alone. The boy has done nothing but obey a princess, and I will not have him punished for your worries. And you will come to no more council meetings for a time. Rest. Visit the country. You have carried too much for too long, and it has made you see enemies in the shadows." His voice softened further into something almost tender, and it broke her heart clean in two. "I say this because I love you. Go and rest." There was nothing left to say. Every road was closed. If she argued, she proved his fear that she had lost herself. If she accused Vane now with only half her proof, she would be dragged out as a woman unwell. Her brother had, with the gentlest words imaginable, stripped her of her council seat, cut her off from the records, forbidden her from her one ally, and sent her away from the palace, and he thought, truly believed, that he was doing it out of love. Merrick Vane stood by the window with his sorrowful, patient face, and did not smile. He was far too clever to smile. But as Rowena turned to go, she caught his eyes for the briefest instant, and in them she saw it not triumph exactly, but something colder and more final, the look of a man closing a ledger he considered settled. She walked out of the king's study with her back straight and her steps even, past the guards who would not look at her, down the long, cold corridors of the palace where she had run as a child. She did not let her face change until she reached her own rooms and shut the door behind her. Only then did she allow herself, for one moment, to feel the full weight of how completely she had lost. She had lost her council seat. She had lost the records. She had been ordered from the palace. She had been made, in her brother's eyes and soon in the whole court's gossip, into a sad old woman driven strange by loneliness and love. And Merrick Vane's committee, the quiet room, the closing door, would now sail through the council unopposed, because the only person who had ever stood against it had just been sent away to rest in the country. It was total. It was, by every measure that a court could count, a complete defeat. Rowena stood in the middle of her quiet room for a long time. Outside her window, the gray rivers of Ashenreach ran on toward the sea, patient and cold, the way they had for 400 years. She watched them and let herself grieve, not for her seat, and not even for her pride, but for her brother, who had looked at her with pity and thought it was love, and who was about to sign away the soul of his own kingdom to the smiling man at his elbow, and would never even know he had done it. And then slowly, something in her hardened, because grief, she had always known, was a room you were allowed to visit but not to live in. Vane had beaten her. Yes, he had been faster and cleverer and crueler, and he had used the best thing in her against her, and he had won every piece on the board. But he had made one error, and it was the same error he had made in the council chamber, and he had made it because men like Vane could never truly understand people like her. He thought that by taking away her seat and her records and her allies and her place, he had taken away her power. He did not understand that her power had never come from any of those things. She had never had a crown. She had never had a vote. She had never had an army. Everything he had stripped from her had been borrowed anyway. What she truly had, the only thing she had ever had, was that she would not stop. She would not let it go. She would not sit down. And that was the one thing in all the world that Merrick Vane, for all his cleverness, did not know how to take away from a person, because he had never once met anyone who possessed it. She was banished from the palace, fine, then she would fight from outside it. She was forbidden the records, fine. She had already read the ones that mattered, and they were written now in her memory where no chancellor could reach. She was cut off from Tobin, fine. But a boy who would risk his whole family's honor to write the truth in daylight was not a boy who would stop writing it simply because a princess had gone away. He was out there still, in the vault room with his pen and his conscience. She had lit something in him, and men like Vane never understood that either, that a single lit thing left alone in the dark does not go out. It looks for other things to light. Rowena went to her writing desk. She took out a clean sheet of paper, and in her plain, straight hand she began to make a list, not of her enemies, but of the lords who had been missing on the thin-chambered days. The ones Vane had sent away so they could not argue, because those were the lords who had been robbed of their voice without even knowing it. Those were the lords who, if they ever learned what had been done, would have every reason in the world to be angry. She had spent her whole life believing that power should speak in daylight. Vane had just taught her, at bitter cost, that it did not do so on its own. Someone had to carry the light from room to room. Someone had to walk it by hand to the people who had been left in the dark. Very well. She had nothing else to do now, banished to the country with no seat and no vote. She would carry the light herself. Rowena dipped her pen, and beneath the list of names she wrote a single line, the first move in a war that everyone but her believed was already over. They think the door is closed. Let us go and knock on it together. Then she folded the paper, put on her plain gray cloak one last time, and went to find the first name on her list. Every long game comes down, in the end, to a single room and a single moment. Princess Rowena had spent her whole life learning patience, and now she would need every hour of it, because the thing she was about to attempt had never been done in 400 years of Ashenreach. She was going to walk back into the palace that had banished her, stand in the chamber she had been forbidden, and force the truth into daylight in front of the very king who had called her mad, and she was going to do it with no seat, no vote, no army, and no proof except what a handful of forgotten men were brave enough to say out loud. If she failed, she would lose not only the kingdom's oldest promise but her brother forever. She knew all of this. On the cold morning it began. She went anyway. The weeks of her banishment had not been rest. They had been the hardest work of her life. She had ridden the country roads of Ashenreach in her plain gray cloak, from one lord's estate to the next, and she had knocked on doors that were not expecting her. Some had turned her away. Word had spread, exactly as Vane intended, that the Princess Royal had grown strange and sad in her old age, and more than one great house had received her with the careful, pitying politeness that people give to someone they believe is unwell. She had borne it without flinching. She had learned long ago that pride was a luxury and she could not afford it now. But at each house she had done the same simple thing. She had not accused, she had not raged. She had only asked one quiet question. On such and such a day last spring, the day the Eastern Valley grants were decided, were you at the council, my lord? And when the lord frowned and said no, he had been called away, some matter at home, some illness, some hunt, she had asked the next quiet question. And who called you away? And she had watched the frown deepen as, one by one, these proud and clever men began to remember that the reasons they had left the capital on those particular days had all, in one way or another, come to them through the office of the Lord Chancellor. It is a strange thing to watch a man realize he has been robbed. It does not happen all at once. It happens slowly, like frost forming on glass. First there is confusion, then denial, then the cold, spreading anger of a man who understands that he has been made a fool of, and there is no anger in the world quite like the anger of a proud man who has been quietly, patiently, condescendingly played. Rowena had lit that frost in 7 houses. 7 lords who had been sent away on the days that mattered, so that their voices could not be counted. 7 lords who owned mines and harbors and valleys that had, through new houses with old money, quietly become the property of the family Vane. She did not have to convince them of anything. She only had to show them where to look, and let their own eyes do the rest, and let their own pride do what her arguments never could. And Tobin, brave, frightened Tobin, had done the rest from inside. She could not reach him, but he could reach her. Copies of the records began to arrive at her country lodging, carried by a baker's boy who did not know what he carried, written out in a careful clerk's hand and folded small. The attendance lists, the votes, the paper trail that led, thread by thread, back to a single family. Tobin had risked everything to copy them. If he were caught, he would lose more than his post. He knew it, and he did it anyway, because 3 generations of his family had written the truth in daylight, and he would not be the one to stop. By the time the frost had spread through all 7 houses, Rowena had what she had lacked in the king's study. Not a feeling, not half a case. She had proof, and she had witnesses, and she had 7 angry lords who would say what they knew out loud in the open, where it could be heard. But she still had one problem, and it was the hardest of all. She was banished. She had no seat in the council. She could not simply walk into the long chamber and speak. The moment she appeared, the guards would remove her, gently, sorrowfully, as a sad woman who did not know her place, and Vane would use it as the final proof that she was unwell. She needed a way into the room that the law itself would force open. She needed a door that even Merrick Vane could not close. And in the end, it was Vane himself who gave it to her. Because his cleverness, like all great cleverness, had a blind spot, and his blind spot was that he believed the old rules were dead. The vote on his committee was set at last. After weeks of quiet arranging, the Lord Chancellor had chosen his day. It would be a full council. He wanted it full this time, wanted it witnessed, so that his quiet room would be born in the open and no one could ever say it had been stolen. He was that confident now. With Rowena gone and the king firmly his, he no longer feared the daylight. He would let the whole council watch him win. And the oldest rule of that council, the rule Rowena had spent her life believing in, the rule Vane thought was a falling down house, held one clause that the Lord Chancellor, in all his cleverness, had never bothered to truly read. Because he did not respect it, because he thought it was old and toothless and gone. Any person of royal blood may claim the right of the open floor. Once in their life, on any single matter, unbanished by any power but the full council's own vote, they may stand before the chamber and be heard to the end, and no one may remove them, and no one may silence them until they have finished speaking. It had not been used in 200 years. Most of the court had forgotten it existed. Vane had certainly forgotten it, or never known it, because a man who saw the old ways as rubble does not study the load-bearing stones. But Tobin knew it. The clerk whose whole family existed to remember the truth of the kingdom knew every clause in every volume, and he had sent it to Rowena folded small in a baker's basket, with a single line in his careful hand. "This is the door, your highness. They cannot close it. Come and knock." So on the morning of the vote, while the lords filed into the long chamber and Merrick Vane arranged his papers, and King Aldous took his tired seat at the head of the table, the great doors opened one last time, and Princess Rowena walked in. The chamber went silent, every head turned. A guard stepped forward uncertain, his hand half raised. Vane rose smoothly from his place, his sorrowful face already arranging itself into concern. "Your Highness," he said gently, "you are not well. You are not meant to be here. Let these good men take you somewhere to rest." "I claim the right of the open floor," Rowena said. The words fell into the room like stones into a deep well. For a moment no one moved, because most of them did not even know what she meant. But at the far end of the chamber, at his clerk's table, Tobin rose to his feet, pale and shaking, and spoke in a voice that cracked and then steadied. "The right of the open floor is real, my lords. It is written in the Founding Charter, Volume 1, the 4th clause. Any person of royal blood may claim it once. When it is claimed, they may not be removed and may not be silenced until they have finished speaking. It has been law for 400 years." He swallowed. "It cannot be refused, not by the Chancellor, not by the Council, not," his voice trembled but held, "not even by the King." Every eye went to Merrick Vane, and for the first time in the whole long game, Rowena watched the mask fail completely. Not slip, fail, because he understood in that instant that he had been beaten by the very thing he had spent his life despising, the old rule, the daylight rule, the falling down house that had, at the crucial moment, held. He had wanted a full council to witness his victory. He had filled the room himself. And now the room was full of witnesses who could not, by the kingdom's oldest law, be made to look away. "Let her speak," said King Aldous. Everyone turned to him. He was looking at his sister with an expression Rowena could not read, tired, yes, and wary, but underneath it something else, something almost like a man waking slowly from a long sleep. "The law is the law," he said quietly. "If my sister claims the open floor, she has it. I will not be the king who broke a rule 400 years old to silence his own blood. Speak, Rowena, to the end. No one will stop you." And so she spoke. She did not rage. She did not accuse, not at first. She spoke plainly, in the simple direct way that was the whole of who she was, and she laid the stones down one by one, exactly as she had always meant to. She told them about the thin days, the votes that happened when the chamber was empty, and how the empty chairs were never random. She turned to the 7 lords she had visited, and one by one she asked them the quiet question in front of everyone. On the day of the Eastern grants, my lord, were you here? And one by one, their faces hard with the cold anger that had been building for weeks, they answered, No, I was called away. And who called you? And each lord named the same office, the same man. She told them about the new trading houses, the old money in new coats, and where every thread led when you followed it down. She did not ask them to believe her. She held up Tobin's copies, the records, the votes, the ownership traced house by house to the family Vane, and she said simply, Do not trust me. I am, after all, only a sad old woman sent away to rest. Trust the paper. The paper was written in daylight. Read it yourselves. And they did. The copies passed hand to hand down the great oak table, and Rowena watched the frost spread through the whole chamber the way it had spread through the 7 houses, watched proud man after proud man understand that he had been played. The room began to murmur, then to rumble, and the rumble had the low, dangerous sound of many powerful people discovering at the same moment that they had been robbed. Then, and only then, she turned to her brother. I did not do this in shadow, brother, she said, and now her voice was not level any more. Now it carried the whole weight of everything she had carried alone for so long. I went to the vault room in the open, because the law let me. I rode to the country lords in the open and asked them open questions. And I come to you now not in a private study where one man can whisper in your ear, but here, in the full council, in daylight, in front of every lord and every clerk, because that is the whole soul of this kingdom, and it is the very thing he tried to take from you. He told you I was scheming in the dark. Brother, look around you. He is the one who needed the dark. I am the one who has spent every step of this fighting to stay in the light. King Aldous was very still. He looked at the papers in his hands. He looked at the 7 angry lords. He looked at Tobin, standing white and brave at the clerk's table. And at last he looked at Merrick Vane. And Vane, cornered, did the thing that finally undid him. He reached one last time for the weapon that had worked so well before. He turned to the king with his sorrowful, patient face, and he said softly, Majesty, you see how far this sickness has gone. She has built an entire fantasy. She has frightened these good lords with coincidence and old ledgers. I beg you, do not let a grieving woman's need to feel important tear apart. Enough. The word did not come from Rowena, it came from the king. And it did not come tired. For weeks, for 2 long winters, Aldous had leaned on this man, and let this man sort his papers and arrange his days and tell him, gently, what was small and what was great. And in that one word, the whole court heard something return to the king's voice that had been missing so long they had forgotten the sound of it. It was the voice of the young king who could smell a lie across a crowded hall. Vane had made one mistake too many. He had called Rowena's love a sickness one time too often, and this time he had done it in front of the king with the proof already in the king's own hands, and something in Aldous that had been sleeping finally, fully, woke. You have called my sister mad, the king said slowly, rising from his chair, and though his body was still old and still tired, his eyes were terrible now and clear. You have called her love a sickness. You have stood at my elbow for a year and sorted my papers and told me what to sign, and I signed it because I was tired and because you made the tiredness easier to bear, and I was grateful. He set the papers down on the table. But I am reading them now, Merrick, in daylight, as my sister asked. And I find that every thin day was your doing, and every stolen vote led to your house, and the only fantasy in this room is the one you built to keep me from ever reading a single page. Majesty, you did not want a faster council. The king's voice rose, and it filled the great chamber, the way a king's voice is meant to. You wanted a room with a door you could shut. You wanted to move the business of my kingdom out of the daylight and into a quiet place where only your chosen friends could hear it, so that you could go on robbing me, and my lords and my people forever, and no one would ever write it down. He looked at his sister, and his hard eyes softened, and the softness this time was not pity. It was something far better, it was respect. My sister stood up in this room weeks ago and asked one question: who decides what stays hidden? I did not want to hear it. I was too tired and you were too kind, and it was easier to call her mad than to answer her. His voice dropped, rough with a grief that was real and clean. She was the only person in my whole kingdom telling me the truth, and I sent her away to rest. The chamber was utterly silent. "Take the Lord Chancellor," King Aldous said quietly, "and hold him and let the full council, every lord in daylight, judge what he has done." The guards moved, and Merrick Vane, who had been so patient and so clever and so certain that the world belonged to whoever was quiet enough to take it, was led from the long chamber with nothing left of the mask at all, just a pale, ordinary man who had in the end been beaten not by a clever scheme, but by an old rule and a stubborn woman who would not sit down. At the door he stopped. He turned, and he looked back at Rowena across the length of the chamber, and for one last moment the two careful enemies regarded each other the way they had at the very beginning of the game. "How?" he asked. It was almost a whisper. He did not seem angry. He seemed more than anything genuinely unable to understand it. "I took everything, your seat, your records, your allies, your place, your brother's trust. I left you nothing. How?" Rowena looked at him with something that was not quite pity and not quite kindness. "You took everything I borrowed," she said. "You never understood that none of it was ever the thing. You spent your whole life believing that power is what you can take from a person in the dark. But there is one thing you can never take, Lord Chancellor, because it does not live in a seat or a vote or a record. It lives in the person, and I have had it my whole life. And you have never once possessed it, and that is why you were always, from the very first day, going to lose." She let the silence hold for a moment. "I simply would not stop. That is all it ever was. You are clever. I am not clever. I am only impossible to make quit. And in a long enough game, Lord Chancellor, the one who will not stop always beats the one who is merely clever." They took him away. The great doors closed behind him, and the oldest rule of Ashenreach, power must speak in daylight, stood whole and unbroken, as it had for 400 years, and would now for 400 more. The council did not vote on the committee that day. There was no need. The quiet room died the moment its architect was led from the chamber, and no lord in Ashenreach would ever again propose cutting a door into the daylight, because they had all seen, with their own eyes, exactly what such a door was truly for. Later, when the chamber had emptied, and the lords had gone to spread the story that would be told in Ashenreach for 100 years, and the fires had burned low again in the great cold room, the king and his sister were left alone at the long oak table. Just the two of them, the way it had been when they were children running through these halls, when Hymero had felt like the safest place in all the world. For a long time neither of them spoke. "I called you mad," Aldous said at last. His voice was quiet and old and full of a shame that had nowhere to hide. "My own sister. You were trying to save me, and I looked at you with pity, and I sent you away." He turned to her, and there were tears in his tired eyes. "Can you forgive me, Rowena? I do not know that I could forgive it in your place. I chose him over you. I chose the man who was robbing me over the sister who was saving me, because he made my burden lighter and you made it heavier, and I was too weak and too tired to tell the difference." Rowena was quiet for a moment. Then she reached across the table and took her brother's hand, the way she had not done in years, and she thought about a broken vase and a boy who had taken a beating so his little sister would not have to, and had never once told her, and had let her believe for years that she had somehow escaped punishment by luck. "When we were small," she said softly, "you took a beating that was mine and you never told me. You let me think I got away with it. Do you remember?" The king blinked. You knew about that." "For 40 years." She smiled, that dry, rare smile that so few people ever got to see. "You have been taking my blows my whole life, brother, and never letting me carry any of the weight, so I decided this once to take one of yours." She squeezed his hand. That is not something a person needs to forgive. That is just what it means to love someone. You do not do it because they will thank you. You do it because they are yours, and you would rather carry the blow than watch it land on them. You taught me that when I was 7 years old and did not even know I was learning it. King Aldous wept then, quietly, the way tired old men weep, not with drama but with relief, the relief of a man who has been carrying a wrong for weeks and has finally been allowed to set it down. And his sister held his hand and let him, and did not tell him it was all right, because it had not been all right, and she would not lie to him even now. She simply stayed, which was, in the end, the whole of what she had always done. The story of that day spread across the kingdom as such stories do. But the version the people told was never quite the version that had happened. The people said that Princess Rowena had defeated a great and terrible schemer, that she had outwitted him, that she had been cleverer than the cleverest man in the realm. And Rowena, when she heard these tales, only ever shook her head and smiled her dry smile, because it was not true, and she had never once claimed to be clever. The truth was smaller than the legend and better. She had not been the smartest person in the room. She had never been that, not once in her whole life. She had simply been the one who refused to sit down, the one who would not let it go, the one who, when a clever man built a door and eased it shut, and a whole court agreed it was reasonable, and even her own beloved brother called her mad and sent her away, stood back up, again and again and again, until the door was open and the light came through. Some doors in a palace are never meant to be opened. Princess Rowena had spent her whole life learning which ones, and when she found the one that mattered most, the one behind which the soul of a kingdom was quietly being carried away into the dark, she opened it, and held it open with her own 2 hands, and did not let it close again, no matter what it cost her. She was not a queen, she was not the heir, she held no army and signed no laws. She was only impossible to make quit. And in the end, in the kingdom of Ashenreach, that turned out to be the most powerful thing of all.